My name is Laura Mitchell, and I was 29 years old the morning my sister laughed in a courthouse hallway and told me that a single dollar was exactly what I was worth to our mother. Jessica said it loud enough for the bailiff to hear. $1, Laura. Mom really summed you up, didn't she? I didn't answer. I just held the folder a little tighter against my chest, the way you hold something you're not ready to let anyone see yet. Inside that folder was a document Jessica didn't know existed. A document that would turn her laughter into something else entirely within the hour. What she didn't know was that I had already found the real will 3 weeks earlier. If you've ever been the one in your family who got the leftovers, the hand-me-down coat, the leftover attention, the leftover love, you already know something about waiting. You know how to sit very still while people decide, out loud, in front of you, exactly how little you matter. I spent 29 years learning how to do that. And I spent the last 3 weeks learning how to stop. Because here's what nobody in my family understood about me. While they were busy deciding I was the disappointing one, the quiet one, the one who wouldn't cause trouble, I was becoming the one person in that courthouse who actually knew how the law worked. I'd spent 6 years as a paralegal specializing in probate and estate law. I read wills the way other people read grocery lists, and when my mother's attorney read hers out loud, something in it didn't add up. I'm going to tell you exactly how a dollar turned into justice. But to understand why that dollar hurt so much, you have to understand the family that handed it to me. If you're new here, welcome to Betrayal House. This is the place for people who know what it feels like to be underestimated by the people who were supposed to love them most, and who understand that the quietest kind of justice is usually the most complete. If any part of this story feels familiar, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we go further, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I rate every single one. Now let me take you back to where this actually started. Not in a courtroom, but in a small kitchen in Round Rock, Texas, 22 years before that hallway. To understand the dollar, you have to understand the family that handed it to me. And you have to understand that the unfairness didn't start with a will. It started decades earlier, in ways so small that for years, I told myself I was imagining them. I grew up in a beige split-level house that always smelled like my mother's coffee and my father's cigarettes, even years after he quit smoking and even longer after he left. Barbara Reynolds was my mother's name before she remarried, and everyone who knew her described her the same way. Warm to strangers, generous with compliments, and utterly incapable of treating her 3 children equally. Jessica was the oldest, 38, the year our mother died. 38, and always the golden one. Brian came next, 35. Quieter than Jessica, but somehow always standing just behind her, nodding. And then there was me, the last one, the one everybody said looked like my father, which in my mother's mouth was never a compliment. I remember being 7 years old and watching Jessica get a brand new bicycle for her birthday while I got Jessica's old one, repainted, with a bow taped to the handlebars like that made it new. My mother called it practical. She called a lot of things practical that were really just her telling me, without ever saying the words, that I came second. Third, really. Third, always. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being the child who doesn't get chosen. It's quiet. It doesn't scream. It just sits there, in the corner of every birthday, every holiday, every parent-teacher conference where my mother's eyes would drift toward Brian's report card, even when it was my name on the paper in front of her. The clearest memory I have, the one that explains everything that came after, is the family portrait. I was 11. My mother had scheduled a sitting at the Sears Portrait Studio, the kind with the blue background and the fake autumn leaves scattered on the floor. She'd bought Jessica and Brian matching outfits, cream sweaters. She hadn't bought me one. When I asked why, she told me, in front of both of them, that there wasn't room in the frame for 4 people comfortably, and that I could sit for my own picture another time. That other time never came. The portrait hung in our living room for the next 18 years. 3 faces, not mine. There were other moments like that one, smaller, scattered through the years like loose change nobody bothered to pick up. My 12th birthday fell on the same weekend as Brian's junior varsity playoff game, and my mother took Jessica and Brian to the game and left me with my grandmother, who baked me a box cake and told me, not unkindly, that some years just work out that way. I remember the smell of that kitchen, butter and vanilla, and my grandmother's cigarettes on the back porch. I remember thinking, even at 12, that some years just work out that way was a strange thing to say about a birthday that happened on the same date every single year. At Thanksgiving, the year I turned 14, my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, the only relative who ever seemed to notice me at all, pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else watched football in the next room. "You know your mother loves you," she said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of thing adults say when they're trying to convince themselves as much as you. "I know she says that," I told her. Aunt Carol didn't have a response to that. She just squeezed my shoulder and went back to the mashed potatoes, and I understood even then that the adults around me could see it too. They just didn't know what to do about it. So mostly, they didn't do anything at all. Jessica had her own way of reinforcing the message, separate from anything our mother did. I was 12, she was 21, and home from college for the summer, and I'd asked to borrow one of her old textbooks for a school project. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered. "Why would I help you with anything?" she said. "You're basically Dad's kid. Not really one of us." I didn't understand, at 12, that she was repeating something she'd heard adults say about me when they thought I wasn't listening. I just understood that my own sister had drawn a line, out loud, between who counted as family and who didn't, and I was on the wrong side of it. I used to stand in front of it as a teenager and study the negative space where I should have been. Like if I looked hard enough, I could make myself appear in a photograph that had never included me in the first place. Do you know that feeling? Of being told you belong to a family, while watching every piece of evidence prove otherwise? I didn't cry about it anymore by the time I was in high school. Something had hardened in me instead. Not bitterness exactly. More like resolve. I decided, somewhere around 15, that if my mother wasn't going to give me a place in her frame, I was going to build a life so solid that I would never need her to. There was a moment in 10th grade that crystallized it for me more than any other. Career day. Every student was supposed to bring a parent or guardian to talk about their job to the class. Jessica had graduated by then, off at her state school, and my mother volunteered to come speak about her work at the county clerk's office. She confirmed the date with the school twice. She didn't show. I sat in my homeroom and watched every other kid's parent walk in. A firefighter, a pharmacist, somebody's uncle who flew planes, and my chair at the front of the room stayed empty until the teacher quietly moved on to the next student. When I got home that afternoon, my mother was in the kitchen, unbothered, telling me Brian had needed a ride to an orthodontist appointment, and it simply hadn't been possible to do both. I didn't say anything. I went to my room and I made myself a promise, one I kept for the rest of my life without ever writing it down. I would never again build my sense of worth around whether my mother showed up for me. That decision is the reason everything that happened later was even possible. I started working at 16, bagging groceries at the H-E-B 2 miles from our house, saving almost everything I earned in an account my mother didn't know existed. While Jessica floated through a state school on money my mother happily wrote checks for, and Brian dropped out of 2 different programs my mother happily paid for twice, I put myself through community college 1 course at a time, working full-time the entire way through. Nobody drove me to class. Nobody sent care packages. I did it alone, the way I'd learned to do most things. It was in my 2nd year of community college that I found the thing I was actually good at. My contracts professor, a sharp, tired woman named Ms. Alvarez who'd spent 15 years in family law before she started teaching, pulled me aside after an exam and told me I read documents the way most people read faces. I noticed the inconsistency in a paragraph before I noticed anything else about it. She said I should look into paralegal work, estate and probate law specifically, because it rewards exactly the kind of person who reads carefully and says little. I didn't know it yet, but she'd just handed me the exact tool I would need 14 years later to save myself from my own family. Those years weren't easy. I worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour pharmacy 3 nights a week to cover rent. then sat in an 8 a.m. contracts lecture running on gas station coffee and almost nothing else. I failed my first real practice exam in Ms. Alvarez's class, badly, a low C, the kind of grade that makes you question whether you belong somewhere. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot afterward, exhausted, and calling my mother, just to hear a voice that was supposed to be in my corner. "Maybe this isn't the right path for you," she said when I told her about the grade. Not cruelly, almost gently, which somehow made it worse. I didn't fail the next one. I rewrote every practice contract in that class by hand until the language stopped feeling foreign to me, until I could spot a misplaced clause the way you'd spot a crooked picture frame. Ms. Alvarez told me, near the end of the semester, that I had better instincts than paralegals she'd worked with who'd been in the field for a decade. I held on to that sentence for years, on nights when nothing else was holding me up. Before that certificate, though, there was a summer I don't talk about much. The summer I applied to 11 different law offices around Austin and heard nothing back from 9 of them. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment, printouts of rejection emails spread out in front of me like tarot cards I couldn't read, wondering if Ms. Alvarez had been wrong about me. My mother, when I mentioned it on one of our thin, occasional phone calls, told me maybe an office job wasn't really my personality, in the same tone she used to tell me the bicycle was practical. I didn't quit. I took a part-time filing job at a smaller firm just to get my foot in a door, any door, and I stayed late every single night reading through old case files that weren't mine to read, just to teach myself how a real estate dispute actually moved through a courtroom. 6 months later, that same firm created a paralegal position and gave it to me before it was ever posted publicly. It was the first time in my life that hard work had been rewarded exactly the way people promise you it will be, with no asterisk, no favorite child getting there first. I got my paralegal certificate the year I turned 23. There was a small ceremony, folding chairs in a community college gymnasium, my name called over a microphone that crackled. I looked out into the audience. Nobody from my family came. Jessica had a work thing. Brian said he must have written down the wrong date. My mother said she wasn't feeling well, though she posted a photo of herself at brunch with her sister that same afternoon. I sat in my car afterward, still in the polyester gown they made us wear, and I didn't cry. I just sat there and thought, fine, I'll build this without you. And I did. By 26, I had a real job at a mid-sized estate law firm in Austin, Whitfield and Cross, working under 2 partners who specialized in probate litigation, will contests, and elder law. I learned how undue influence gets proven. I learned how notaries can be manipulated, how bank records tell the truth even when people don't, how a will signed under the wrong conditions can be thrown out entirely no matter how official it looks. My first year there, one of the senior partners handed me a file involving an elderly widower whose son had moved back in to help, and within 4 months had rewritten the man's entire estate plan in his own favor. I remember reading through that file, the isolated attorney, the sudden new advisors, the family members quietly frozen out, and thinking it was almost clinical how predictable the pattern was. Isolate the vulnerable parent. Control who they see. Control who they sign in front of. I helped build the case that unwound it. I had no idea, filing that folder away 18 months before my mother's decline began, that I was memorizing the exact playbook someone in my own family would use on her. I had a small apartment near South Congress, a car that was paid off, and a life that, for the first time, actually felt like mine. There was a balcony off my kitchen just big enough for 1 folding chair, and most evenings after work I'd sit out there with a glass of wine and the sound of traffic on South First Street, and I'd think quietly that I had built something real without anyone's help. I had 2 close friends from the firm, a standing Sunday coffee ritual, a running route along the river that I never missed. It wasn't a big life, but it was steady, and it was mine, and after 26 years of being the leftover child, steady felt like winning. My relationship with my mother by then was thin but not hostile. Occasional phone calls, a birthday card every year, usually late. She'd remarried briefly in her 50s to a man named Gerald, who left after 4 years. And after that, she leaned on Jessica and Brian more than ever, especially once her health started to decline in her early 60s. Every Christmas, I drove up to Round Rock for a few hours, ate dinner at a table where the conversation flowed easily around Jessica's kids and Brian's job and rarely toward me, and drove back to Austin the same night rather than stay over. Nobody ever asked me to stay. I stopped waiting for them to. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine. There was one time, about 2 years before my mother's death, when Jessica called asking to borrow $4,000 for what she described as a temporary cash flow problem. I didn't have much saved, but I sent it anyway, because some part of me still hoped that being useful to my family might finally earn me a place in it. She promised to pay it back within 2 months. She never mentioned it again, and when I brought it up gently, almost a year later, she laughed and said she'd genuinely forgotten, and followed that with a line I still remember precisely. "It's not like you needed it, Laura. You've always been fine on your own. That's kind of your whole thing." I didn't ask again. I just filed it away, the way I filed most things away back then, and told myself it didn't matter. It mattered more than I let myself admit. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 18 months before she died. My mother called me, which she almost never did, and in the middle of an ordinary conversation about nothing, she asked me the same question 3 times. "Did I already tell you about the roof?" She had, twice. I didn't think much of it at the time. People repeat themselves. But 2 months later, Jessica called me for the first time in almost a year, and her tone had changed completely. She was warm, almost sweet. She told me she and Brian were handling things with Mom now. Her finances, her doctor's appointments, her day-to-day care, and that I didn't need to worry about any of it. I remember thinking that was strange, because I hadn't offered to worry about any of it, and Jessica had never once in her life used the phrase handling things, without meaning something closer to controlling things. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that maybe, finally, my siblings were stepping up. I was wrong, and the next 18 months would prove it in ways I couldn't have imagined. My mother died on a Thursday in October, in her sleep, in the house I grew up in, with Jessica beside her and Brian down the hall. I got the call from Brian at 6 in the morning. He didn't cry on the phone. He just said, flatly, "Mom's gone," like he was reading me a weather report. I drove to Round Rock in a fog. I sat through the funeral in the second row, behind Jessica and Brian, who sat in the front like it was assigned seating, like grief had a hierarchy, and they'd claimed the top of it. 2 weeks later, we all sat in a conference room at a law office I didn't recognize, not Whitfield and Cross, not any firm my mother had ever mentioned to me, for the reading of her will. The attorney was a man named Roger Dunmore. I'd never heard his name before that day. That detail would matter more than I understood at the time. He had the kind of soft, practiced voice attorneys use when they've read 100 wills to 100 grieving families. And he never once looked up from the page as he read. The room smelled like new carpet and old coffee. Aunt Carol sat 2 chairs down from me, twisting a tissue in her lap. Nobody had told her either. He read through the preliminary sections in a monotone. The house going to Jessica. A retirement account split between Jessica and Brian. A car. Some jewelry. Furniture. Then he reached the final line naming me, and he read it exactly as written. "To my daughter, Laura Mitchell, I leave the sum of $1. Nobody in the room gasped. Nobody looked surprised, which told me, instantly, that everyone else already knew. Jessica turned to me first. $1, Laura. Mom really summed you up, didn't she?" Brian didn't say anything cruel out loud. He just smiled at his lap, which was somehow worse. I didn't yell. I didn't cry in that room. I sat very still, the same way I'd sat very still my entire childhood, and I felt something old and familiar settle over me. The feeling of being told once again exactly how little I mattered. Not rage, not yet, just certainty. I drove home that night instead of staying at a hotel like Jessica and Brian did. I sat on my balcony with the traffic noise below me, and I let myself finally feel something. Alone, where nobody could turn it into a punchline. I didn't cry about the dollar. I cried about the portrait, about the bicycle, about every small moment across 29 years that the dollar had simply made official. Then, somewhere close to midnight, the crying stopped, and something colder and clearer took its place. I thought about every file I'd ever worked on at Whitfield and Cross, every pattern I'd learned to spot, every time I'd told a grieving client that a wrong will doesn't have to be the last word, that documents can be challenged, that the truth usually leaves a paper trail even when people try to hide it. I decided, sitting there in the dark, that I was going to use every single thing I knew. Because here's the thing about spending 6 years reading wills for a living. You develop an instinct for when something is wrong with one. And everything about that will felt wrong to me. The attorney I'd never heard of. The date on the signature page. 4 months before my mother died. Right in the middle of the period when she was calling me and asking about the roof twice in one conversation. The fact that Jessica had described herself as handling things almost exactly around the same time this new will was supposedly signed. I didn't say a word of this in that conference room. I just quietly asked Roger Dunmore for a copy of the document, folded it into my bag, and drove home. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad, and I started doing the only thing I actually knew how to do when my family had wronged me. I started building a case. The next morning, I called the one person who might understand what I was about to do without judging me for it. A former colleague of mine named David Ferris, an estate litigation attorney who'd left Whitfield and Cross to start his own small practice. I'd worked under him for 2 years. I trusted him. His office smelled like leather and old paper, stacks of case files organized in a way that would look chaotic to anyone who hadn't spent years learning his system. A framed photo of his kids sat next to a mug that said, "World's okayest golfer," and somehow that small, ordinary detail made it easier to say what I'd come to say. I sat in his office, and for the first time since the reading, I let myself actually say out loud what I suspected. "I think this will is wrong," I told him. Not wrong like unfair. Wrong like invalid. David leaned back in his chair and asked me to walk him through it. So I did. The new attorney nobody in the family had used before. The timing, right in the window when her memory had started slipping. The fact that Jessica had inserted herself into every part of my mother's life in the months leading up to the signing. David explained it to me in plain terms, the way he always used to when we worked together. In Texas, he said, "A will can be challenged on the grounds of undue influence. If someone shows the person who signed it wasn't acting under their own free will. If someone else controlled their access to information, their access to other advisors, or pressured them during a period of vulnerability." He also told me something that changed the entire shape of what I was about to do. "If there's an earlier will," he said, "and it conflicts with this one and we can show this one is invalid, the earlier one might control instead." I hadn't even considered that. I'd been so focused on proving the dollar will was wrong that I hadn't thought about what might replace it. David asked me one more question before I left his office that day, and it's the question that changed everything. "Who had control of your mother's day-to-day life in her last 2 years? Who picked her doctors? Who picked this new attorney? Who was in the room every time she signed something?" I already knew the answer. Jessica. Jessica had been in the room every time. I went back to work the following Monday like nothing had happened, because that's what I do. I keep functioning, I keep my face calm, while underneath I'm building something. And what I built, over the next several weeks, was quiet, careful, and thorough. My coworker Priya noticed something was off within the first few days. We shared a small office at Whitfield and Cross, close enough that she could hear me on the phone requesting records in a tone I don't usually use for my own cases. Clipped, personal, careful not to let my voice shake. She asked me, over coffee in the break room, if everything was okay. I told her the truth, or most of it. That my mother had died, that the will had cut me out, and that something about the paperwork didn't sit right with me. Priya didn't ask for details. She just said, "You're the best I've ever seen at spotting a bad document. If your gut says something's wrong, it's wrong. Then she covered 2 of my active files for a week without being asked, so I'd have the hours to dig through my own family's mess without falling behind on my actual job. I don't think she ever knew how much that meant to me. I've never really told her. Most nights that month, I came home, made a pot of coffee I didn't need, and spread documents across my kitchen table until 1 or 2 in the morning. Medical records in one pile, bank statements in another, notary logs in a third, color-coded the way I'd learned to organize evidence for other people's cases, never once imagining I'd need the same system for my own mother's. I started with the notary logs. Because I work in this field, I knew exactly which county offices to request records from, and I knew how to read a notarization date against a medical record without anyone realizing what I was cross-referencing. The notary who'd stamped my mother's new will worked out of a UPS store 15 minutes from Jessica's house. Not the notary my mother had used for every other document in her life, who worked 2 blocks from her own home and had known her for a decade. That detail sat in my stomach like a stone. Before I ever drove to that UPS store, I spent 2 full days convinced the real villain was Roger Dunmore, the attorney who'd read the will. I pulled his bar association record, expecting to find him tangled up in whatever Jessica had done. What I found instead was a minor, years-old complaint about slow paperwork on an unrelated case, nothing that suggested he'd have knowingly drafted a fraudulent will. When I finally got him on the phone, he sounded genuinely confused by my questions, almost defensive, insisting he'd simply been retained by the family and had no reason to doubt the woman sitting across from him. I believed him, in the end. Roger Dunmore wasn't the architect of anything. He was just careless, the kind of attorney who takes a referral and a check without asking the questions he should have asked. It cost me 2 days I didn't have to spare, chasing the wrong person. But it also taught me something useful, that whoever had picked him precisely because he wouldn't ask questions. That detail led me right back to the notary and to the UPS store. I drove to that UPS store myself on a Saturday, telling myself I was just curious. The notary behind the counter was a heavy-set man in his 50s who barely looked up from his phone when I asked if he remembered notarizing a document for a Barbara Reynolds. He said he notarizes 100 documents a month and couldn't be expected to remember one woman's name. Then I described her. Small, silver-haired, soft-spoken. Something shifted in his face. There was a woman who came in with her daughter, he said slowly. The daughter did most of the talking. I remember because the older woman looked confused. Kept asking her daughter what she was supposed to be signing. Did you flag that? I asked. Did you say anything? He shrugged, uncomfortable now. It's not really my job to evaluate someone's mental state, ma'am. I just check the ID and stamp the page. I thanked him and left before my hands started shaking in front of him. That same week, my phone rang twice from a blocked number, late at night, and whoever it was hung up both times without saying a word. I didn't know it then, but I'd find out later that Jessica had been the one calling, checking, I think, whether I'd pick up, whether I'd already found enough to be dangerous. At the time, I just added it to the list of things that didn't sit right. Next, I pulled, carefully, legally, through channels I was authorized to use as an estate professional handling my own mother's affairs. The timeline of my mother's medical visits in the year before she signed that will. Her primary care doctor had noted, 4 months before the signing date. Patient reports increased forgetfulness. Family expresses concern. 2 months before the signing, a neurologist had flagged early-stage cognitive decline and recommended a follow-up assessment. That follow-up assessment never happened. Instead, 3 weeks after that neurology appointment, my mother signed a will disinheriting me down to a single dollar, in front of an attorney none of us had ever met, notarized by someone she'd never used before, arranged entirely by Jessica. I sat with that information for a long time before I let myself feel anything about it, because feeling it meant admitting what it actually was. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was elder financial abuse. And it was Jessica. I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you have lived through something like this yourselves, watching someone in your family circle a vulnerable parent like they're circling an asset instead of a person. If that's you, I want you to know something before we go any further. You're not imagining it, and you're not powerless, even when it feels that way. If this story is hitting close to home, drop a comment below with one word, just one, that describes how it felt the moment you realized your family saw you as less. I read these, every one of them, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to feel less alone in it. Now let's go back to that stack of bank records, because that's where things got even darker. I pulled 12 months of my mother's bank statements, records I had legal standing to access as the executor named to handle her final affairs. Ironically enough, a role Jessica hadn't managed to strip from me even while stripping everything else. Buried in those statements were 4 transfers, each just under $3,000, spaced out over 8 months, all moving from my mother's checking account into an account belonging to Jessica. Almost $12,000. Moved while my mother's own doctor was documenting memory loss. Moved by the same daughter who told me, with a straight face, in a conference room, that our mother had really summed me up with a single dollar. I also tracked down my mother's last home health aide, a woman named Denise who'd checked in on her twice a week during the final year. I found her through an agency listed on one of the bank statements, and when I called, she was hesitant at first, careful the way people are when they're worried about their job. But when I explained who I was, her voice softened. "I always felt bad about something," Denise told me. "Your mother used to ask me, some visits, whether I'd met her daughter Laura. Not the other 2. You." She'd get this look on her face, kind of far away, like she was trying to remember something she'd lost. "I mentioned it to your sister once, and she told me Mrs. Reynolds got confused sometimes, and I shouldn't put too much stock in it. I asked Denise if she'd be willing to put that in a written statement. She said yes, without hesitating. There's a particular kind of pain in a stranger confirming what you already suspected, that even confused, even fading, some small part of your mother had been trying to find her way back to you. There's a particular kind of anger that doesn't look like anger from the outside. It looks like calm. It looks like someone very quietly building a folder. That was me, for the next several weeks. I found something else buried in those bank records. A wire transfer to a legal services company I didn't recognize, dated almost 2 years before my mother's death. More than a year before the dollar will was even signed. It wasn't a large amount, just enough to cover a basic consultation fee. I didn't understand what it meant yet, but I wrote the name down. Because in this line of work, you learn that the detail you don't understand yet is usually the one that matters most later. I want to stop here for just a second, because we're at the halfway point of this story, and I think it's worth asking you something directly. Have you ever had to build your own case against the people who were supposed to protect you? Not in a courtroom, necessarily. Maybe just in your own mind, gathering the receipts, quietly proving to yourself that what happened to you was real? If you have, I want you to comment the word proof below. Let's see how many of us are in this together. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because what happens in the second half of this story is the part nobody in my family saw coming. Let's keep going. Word got back to Jessica about 3 weeks into my investigation that I'd been asking questions. I still don't know exactly how. Maybe the notary's office mentioned my request. Maybe a mutual family friend let something slip. But one evening my phone rang, and it was Jessica, and her voice had none of the sweetness from that call 18 months earlier. "I heard you've been snooping around Mom's accounts," she said. "You need to let this go, Laura." "I'm just trying to understand what happened," I told her. "What happened," she said, "is that Mom finally saw you clearly. She saw what the rest of us always saw, that you were never really part of this family. Not the way we were." I felt that sentence land exactly where she meant it to. Not because it was true, because it was the same sentence, dressed differently, that I'd been hearing since I was 11 years old, standing in front of a portrait with no room in the frame for me. Brian called 2 days later. He wasn't as sharp as Jessica, but he was more direct. "Whatever you think you found," he said, "it's not going to change anything. The will is signed. It's legal. You're just embarrassing yourself." I didn't argue with either of them. I just said I'd let the process play out, and I hung up. 3 days after that, Jessica showed up at my apartment building without calling first. I found her leaning against my car in the parking garage when I left for work, arms crossed, sunglasses on despite the low morning light. "Do you remember the portrait?" she asked, before I even said hello. "The one Mom never put you in? Maybe she just knew, even then, that you'd turn into this. Somebody who digs through her dying mother's bank statements instead of grieving like a normal person." "I remember the portrait," I said. "I think about it more than you'd guess." She didn't have a response for that. She just got in her car and drove off, and I stood there in the garage for a long moment before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive. I didn't tell David about that particular conversation until later. At the time, I just went to work, and I filed it away with everything else. Another piece of proof, in its own strange way, that I was getting close to something they couldn't afford for me to find. That same week, Jessica added me back into the family group text for the first time in months, and I understood immediately it wasn't an olive branch. It was a warning shot dressed up as inclusion. Extended cousins and my uncle chimed in about how sad it was to see the family falling apart over money. Brian sent a message directly under that one. "Some of us just want to move on. Money isn't everything, Laura." I didn't respond in the thread. I took a screenshot of it instead, because by then I'd learned that everything they wrote down could someday be read back to them in a room where it actually mattered. The following weekend, my Aunt Carol convinced me to come to a small family gathering at her house, mostly cousins and a couple of family friends, the kind of low-stakes event that would have felt safe a year earlier. Jessica showed up too. I hadn't expected her. Halfway through dinner, in front of 8 or 9 people, Jessica set down her fork and announced, loudly enough that the room went quiet, that she thought everyone should know Laura was trying to profit off Mom's death by contesting a will she'd already accepted. "I never accepted anything," I said, as calmly as I could manage. "I ask questions. That's different." "You're humiliating this family," she said, digging through bank statements like some kind of detective for a woman who spent her whole life taking care of you. Aunt Carol set her glass down harder than she needed to. "Barbara didn't take care of that girl, Jessica. You know that better than anyone." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Jessica's face went tight, and she excused herself from the table without finishing her meal. I sat there afterward, shaking slightly, and Aunt Carol reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. The same steady gesture she'd been offering me since I was 14 years old. I went home that night more certain than ever that I wasn't imagining any of it. That confrontation should have scared me into stopping. Instead, it did the opposite. Because if the will really was as airtight as they believed, they wouldn't have needed to call me at all. People don't threaten you over nothing. They threaten you when you're getting close to something. That night, I sat with the name I'd written down weeks earlier, the legal services company from that early wire transfer, and I finally sat down and actually looked it up properly. It wasn't a large firm. It was a 2-person estate planning practice in a strip mall off Route 620, run by a solo attorney named Patricia Osei. I called the number listed on their website the next morning, half expecting a dead end. Instead, a receptionist confirmed that Patricia Osei had, in fact, met with a client named Barbara Reynolds, my mother, nearly 2 years before her death, before the dollar will, before Jessica's $12,000, before any of it. I asked as gently and professionally as I could whether Ms. Osei might be willing to speak with me, given that I was the named executor on my mother's estate. 2 days later, I sat across from Patricia Osei in a small office that smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner, and she told me something that changed the entire shape of everything I thought I understood about my mother. Patricia was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with careful eyes and a way of choosing her words like she measured them before she let them out. She pulled a thin folder from a locked cabinet behind her desk before she said anything substantial, and she set it down between us like she was handing over something fragile. "I remember her," Patricia said. "It's not common, a woman coming in completely alone for something like this. Most people bring a spouse, an adult child, somebody. She came by herself, in a cab, and she was very clear about what she wanted, even though she cried through most of the meeting. My mother had come to her alone. No family members present. She'd told Patricia that she was worried about the influence her older children had over her, and that she wanted to put something in place that would protect her youngest daughter. Protect me, in case anything happened to her before she could make things right in person. Patricia had drafted a will for her that day, a real one, signed, witnessed, and properly notarized, more than a year before the dollar will Jessica had orchestrated. In that earlier, and as it would turn out more legally sound, document, my mother left the bulk of her estate to me, not out of spite toward Jessica and Brian, out of guilt. Patricia told me my mother had cried during that meeting, had said something along the lines of, "I let my other two convince me that Laura was the problem, and I think I've been wrong my whole life." I sat in that office and I didn't cry either. Not at first. I just felt something inside me, something that had been braced and defensive for 29 years. Finally, quietly, exhale. She saw it. She saw what she'd done. She just never told me while she was alive. Patricia had one more thing for me. An envelope, sealed, that my mother had asked her to hold on to and deliver only if it ever became necessary. Meaning, only if the will Patricia drafted was ever challenged or replaced. It had become necessary. I didn't open it there in the office. I drove home first, sat at the same kitchen table where I'd started building this case weeks earlier, and I opened it alone. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated almost 2 years before my mother's death. I'm not going to tell you everything it said. Some of it is mine to keep, but I'll tell you the line that mattered most, the one I read probably a dozen times that night. If you're reading this, it means they found a way around what I wanted. Don't let them win, Laura. You were always the one who saw things clearly. Use it. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I called David Ferris and told him everything. Together, we mapped out a plan. Patricia's earlier will predated the dollar will by well over a year. If we could show the later will was the product of undue influence, the isolated attorney, the unfamiliar notary, the documented cognitive decline, the suspicious bank transfers, all of it, a court could invalidate it. And if that happened, Patricia's earlier will, the one my mother signed alone, clear-eyed and finally honest with herself, would control the entire estate instead. David laid it out on a whiteboard in his office, timeline down one side, evidence down the other, connecting lines between them like a diagram from one of my old contracts classes. He tapped the marker against the date of the neurology appointment. "This is our anchor," he said. "Everything after this date gets harder for them to defend. Everything before it is clean. Your mother's real will falls on the clean side. Theirs doesn't." I asked him what our odds actually were, because I'd learned enough in 6 years to know that judges don't always rule the way the evidence suggests they should. "Strong," he said. "Stronger than most contests I've run. But Laura, I need you prepared for the fact that they're going to come after your character before they come after the facts. That's what people do when the facts aren't on their side." He was right. It just took them a little longer than I expected. David and I decided not to confront Jessica and Brian privately. Given how they'd already reacted to me simply asking questions, a quiet conversation would only give them time to hide records, pressure witnesses, or worse. Instead, we chose to file everything formally, ahead of the probate hearing already scheduled to finalize distribution of the estate. The same hearing, as it happened, where Jessica had laughed at me in the hallway 3 weeks after I'd already found the truth. She had no idea what I was walking in with. She thought she was walking into a formality. She was walking into the end of everything she'd built on top of my mother's confusion and my own silence. The morning of the hearing, I stood in that courthouse hallway with the folder against my chest, and Jessica made her joke about the dollar, and Brian smiled at his shoes, and neither of them noticed that I wasn't flinching anymore. We want to pause one more time before I tell you what happened inside that courtroom, because I think this is the moment that matters most in the entire story. If you've ever had to sit quietly while someone underestimated you, gathering what you needed instead of giving them the reaction they wanted, I want you to know that moment is doing something. It's building something, even when it doesn't feel like it. Drop a comment with the word quiet if you've ever had to fight a battle like that without raising your voice. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is genuinely the moment, because the confrontation you're about to hear is the entire reason this channel exists. Let's go inside that courtroom. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood paneling gone slightly gray with age, the low hum of the ventilation system the only sound as we waited for the judge. Aunt Carol sat 2 rows behind me. She reached forward at one point and squeezed my shoulder, the same way she had at that Thanksgiving dinner 15 years earlier, and I understood, this time, that the squeeze meant something different. It meant she believed me. The judge called the matter to order a little after 10 in the morning. Jessica and Brian sat together at one table with their attorney, still relaxed, still certain this was a formality. David and I sat at the other, and when the judge asked if there were any matters to address before finalizing distribution, David stood. "Your Honor, we're filing a formal contest to the will dated 14 months prior to the decedent's death, on grounds of undue influence, alongside evidence of a prior valid will that we believe should control distribution instead." I watched Jessica's face change in real time. Confusion first, then something colder. "What is he talking about?" she whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear. David walked the court through it, piece by piece, exactly the way we'd built it. The unfamiliar attorney Jessica had selected. The unfamiliar notary working out of a UPS store near her own house. The documented cognitive decline in the months leading up to the signing. Decline that had been noted by a neurologist and never followed up on. The $12,000 transferred from our mother's account into Jessica's, timed almost exactly with her assumption of control over our mother's affairs. And then Patricia Osei's earlier will. Signed alone. Witnessed properly. Notarized by someone my mother had used for years. Drafted more than a year before Jessica ever inserted herself into the process. He also submitted Denise's written statement, and read a single line from it into the record. The line about my mother asking, again and again, whether anyone had heard from her daughter Laura. I watched Jessica's attorney glance sideways at her when that line landed, like even he hadn't known about it. And finally, the letter. David read a portion of it aloud, with my permission, into the record. I let my other 2 convince me that Laura was the problem, and I think I've been wrong my whole life. The room went silent in a way I will never forget. Jessica stood up halfway, like she was going to object to something, and then seemed to realize there was nothing left to object to. Brian just stared at the table. David asked the judge for permission to question Jessica directly about the transfers, since she was present and had already been named in the filing. The judge allowed it. David kept his voice level, almost gentle, the way I'd seen him do with hostile witnesses before. "Ms. Reynolds, can you explain the 4 transfers from your mother's account into yours, totaling just under $12,000, made during a period when her own doctor had documented memory loss?" "Those were gifts," Jessica said. "My mother gave me money all the time." "Do you have anything in writing describing them as gifts?" She hesitated. Not specifically, no." "Did your mother ever discuss these transfers with anyone else in the family? With Laura, for instance?" "Why would she tell Laura anything?" Jessica snapped, and then seemed to hear herself say it, the same old contempt slipping out under pressure, exactly the pattern the letter and the aide's statement had already described. David let the silence sit there for a moment before he asked his next question. "Ms. Reynolds, did you select the notary who processed the will dated 14 months before your mother's death?" "I helped her find one that was convenient," Jessica said. "Convenient to whom?" She didn't answer that one at all. The judge asked Jessica's attorney if he had a response. He tried. He argued that grief affects families in complicated ways, that a mother is entitled to leave her estate however she chooses, that I was reading malice into ordinary family dynamics. It was, David told me later, a decent argument for a case that didn't already have a documented neurological diagnosis, an unexplained $12,000, and a signed letter in the decedent's own hand. The judge cut him off before he finished. "Counselor, I've read the neurology report. Has your client addressed why a follow-up assessment recommended by her mother's own doctor never happened?" He didn't have an answer for that either. Not one that held up. Because you can argue with an unfair mother. You cannot argue with a signature, a timeline, and a bank record. The judge ordered a formal evaluation of both wills, with a strong preliminary finding, based on the evidence already presented, that the later will show clear indicators of undue influence. Barring anything unexpected, Patricia's earlier will would very likely stand. Jessica's attorney tried once more, asking the court to at least delay any preliminary finding until a full hearing could be scheduled. The judge, a woman with silver hair and very little patience for theater, looked over her glasses and said the delay wouldn't change what was already in the record. "The documents speak for themselves, counselor," she said. "I'd suggest your client spend the delay preparing, not hoping." As we walked out of that courtroom, Jessica caught up to me in the same hallway where she'd made her joke 3 weeks earlier. "You planned this," she said. "You knew. And you let me humiliate myself. You did that part yourself," I told her. "I just showed up with the truth." She didn't have anything to say to that. For the first time in 29 years, neither did I need her to. The weeks that followed moved the way these things move. Slowly, procedurally, without the drama people expect from a moment like that. But they moved in a direction that mattered. Jessica was formally found to have exercised undue influence over our mother in her final years, a finding that came with real consequences, not just the loss of the inheritance she thought she'd secured, but a civil liability for the $12,000 she'd transferred out of our mother's account without proper authority. She had to repay it, with interest, directly to the estate. Her husband, who had apparently known about at least some of what she was doing, filed for divorce 4 months later. I don't take pleasure in that part. I just recognize it as what happens when the truth stops being containable. Her oldest daughter, my niece, reached out to me privately a few months afterward. She was 19, old enough to have quietly noticed things over the years that nobody had ever explained to her. She asked if we could get coffee sometime. We have, twice now. She's the one member of that side of the family I still see, and I intend to keep it that way. Brian's consequences were quieter but no less real. He lost the portion of the estate the dollar will had promised him, and with it, he lost the version of himself that had always coasted on being someone else's favorite. The last I heard, he'd moved 2 states away and rarely speaks to Jessica anymore. I think, in the end, he understood he'd been a passenger in something he never had the courage to stop. He called me once, about 6 months after everything settled. He didn't apologize. Not exactly. He just said he was sorry things had gotten so complicated, which is the closest Brian has ever come to admitting fault about anything. I told him I appreciated the call. I haven't heard from him since, and I've made peace with the idea that I might not again. Aunt Carol and I, on the other hand, grew closer than we'd ever been. She was the one who sat with me through most of the hearings, the one who told me, the week after the judge's ruling, that she'd always suspected something was wrong and had never known how to say it out loud. We have dinner now most months. She keeps a photo of me on her refrigerator. Just me, no frame excluding anyone. And every time I see it, something in my chest loosens a little. As for me, Patricia's original will was upheld in full. The house I grew up in, the one with the portrait that never had room for me, became mine. I sold it within the year. Not out of spite, just because some rooms hold too much weight to keep living inside them. Before I closed on the sale, I went back one last time. The portrait was still there, packed now, wrapped in moving blankets, leaning against a wall in an empty living room. I stood in front of it the way I used to as a teenager, studying that negative space where I should have been. Then I picked it up, and instead of throwing it away, I had a small frame made, just for me, with my mother's letter inside it instead. The line that mattered most, printed in her own handwriting. "You were always the one who saw things clearly. Use it." That's what hangs on my wall now. Not the portrait that excluded me. The proof that, in the end, she saw me. People ask me sometimes if I forgive Jessica. I tell them the truth, which is that forgiveness was never really the point for me. What mattered was refusing to let her version of the story be the last word. Refusing to let $1 be the final sentence in a story that was actually mine to write. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I think there is, it's this. You don't have to scream to be believed. You don't have to fight loud to win. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, when the people who are supposed to love you decide you're worth exactly $1, is stay quiet, stay steady, and go find the truth yourself. They laughed at $1. They never once imagined I already had the real will in my hands. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one your family underestimated, the one they thought would just accept whatever they handed you, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about quiet people who win without ever raising their voice, make sure you're subscribed, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one.